Victoria Sterling rushed down Fifth Avenue, her worn leather messenger bag bouncing against her hip as she dodged through the morning crowd. The September air carried the scent of coffee and car exhaust, mixing with the crisp promise of autumn. She glanced at her phone for the third time in 2 minutes. Watching the little car icon on her rideshare app inch closer to her location, running late had become her specialty lately. Between her job at the Morrison Art Gallery, her evening law, classes at Columbia, and her weekend shifts at the local bookstore, Victoria felt like she was constantly racing against time. Today was particularly crucial because she had a presentation for potential investors who might save the struggling gallery. The silver. Tesla pulled up to the curb just as the app notification pinged. Victoria didn't hesitate. She yanked open the door and slid into the plush leather seat, immediately struck by the car's immaculate interior and the subtle scent of expensive cologne. "Metropolitan Museum, please," she said breathlessly, pulling out her laptop to review her notes one final time. "And if you could hurry, I have a really important meeting." The silence stretched longer than usual. Victoria looked up from her screen, expecting to see the familiar partition, or at least hear a response from the driver. Instead, she found herself staring at a man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. His dark hair perfectly styled, strong jaw clean-shaven, and piercing blue eyes that were currently fixed on her with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been amusement. This was definitely not her usual rideshare driver. The moment of panic, "Excuse me," the man said slowly, his voice carrying a slight British accent that somehow made everything sound more expensive. "I think there's been some confusion." Victoria's brain processed several things at once. First, this car was far too nice to be a rideshare vehicle. Second, the man behind the wheel was wearing a watch that probably cost more than her annual rent. Third, and most importantly, she was sitting in a stranger's car. And that stranger looked like he could afford to make people disappear without anyone asking questions. Her fight-or-flight response kicked in with surprising intensity. "Oh, God," she whispered, her voice rising to a near shriek. "You're going to kidnap me. I knew I shouldn't have gotten in. My friend Rebecca always tells me to check the license plate, but did I listen? No, I never listen." Julian Blackstone, CEO of Blackstone Technologies, and one of the youngest billionaires in the country, found himself in the unprecedented situation of being accused of kidnapping by a young woman, who had apparently materialized in his car like some sort of well-dressed tornado. "I'm not going to kidnap you," he said calmly, though his eyebrows had risen nearly to his hairline. "You got into my car." "That's exactly what a kidnapper would say," Victoria shot back, her green eyes wide with panic. "Next you'll tell me you're actually a really nice guy who just happens to drive around in expensive cars picking up random women?" "Well," Julian said thoughtfully, "the expensive car part is accurate." Victoria's phone buzzed with a notification. Her actual rideshare driver was texting to say he was still 5 minutes away and asking if she was the one who'd gotten into the wrong silver. The realization the notification seemed to deflate Victoria's panic like air leaving a balloon. She stared at her phone, then at Julian, then back at her phone. "You're not my Uber driver," she said slowly. "No," Julian confirmed. "I'm not. And you're not a kidnapper?" "Definitely not." Victoria closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, her cheeks had turned a charming shade of pink. "I'm so incredibly sorry," she said, already reaching for the door handle. "I thought you were my ride, and when you didn't respond immediately, I just assumed the worst. I watch too many crime documentaries. Rebecca always says I'm paranoid. But in New York, you can never be too careful, and I was running late, which makes me irrational, and I probably just ruined your entire morning." She was rambling now, words tumbling over each other in her haste to explain and escape. Julian found himself oddly reluctant to let her go. In his world of carefully orchestrated meetings and calculated interactions, this moment of genuine, unfiltered human response was refreshing. "Actually," he said, glancing at his own watch, "I was heading to the Met District anyway. I could give you that ride you were looking for." Victoria paused with her hand on the door. "That's very kind, but I've already caused enough trouble. Plus, accepting rides from strangers goes against everything my mother taught me about city safety." "Julian Blackstone," he said, extending his hand with a slight smile. Now I'm not a stranger anymore. The name tickled something in Victoria's memory. She'd heard it before, probably in one of the business articles she skimmed for her. Economics class. Victoria Sterling, she replied, shaking his hand and noting how warm and steady it felt. And I suppose technically you're not a stranger anymore, but you're still someone I accidentally attempted to carjack. Is that what happened here? I thought you were just really confident about ride-sharing etiquette. Despite everything, Victoria laughed. It was a genuine, musical sound that seemed to brighten the interior of the already impressive car. The unexpected connection, you know what? Victoria said, settling back into the seat. If you're sure you don't mind the detour, I would actually appreciate the ride. A presentation is in 20 minutes, and at this point, taking another ride share would definitely make me late. Julian pulled smoothly into traffic, and Victoria couldn't help but notice how different this felt from her usual cramped rides in cars that smelled like the previous passenger's lunch. The Tesla moved silently through the city streets, and she found herself relaxing despite the unusual circumstances. Presentation? Julian asked, genuinely curious. Work-related. I work at an art gallery, Victoria explained, pulling her notes back out. We're meeting with potential investors today. The gallery has been struggling financially, and if we don't secure funding soon, we'll have to close. She paused, realizing she was probably oversharing with someone she'd just met. But something about Julian's attentive silence encouraged her to continue. It's not just about the job, though that would be devastating enough. The Morrison Gallery showcases emerging artists who might not get opportunities elsewhere. Launched the careers of 12 artists in the past 3 years. If we close, those artists lose their platform, and the neighborhood loses one of its few cultural spaces. Julian found himself genuinely impressed by her passion. In his world, most conversations revolved around profit margins and market share. Here was someone talking about art and community impact with the same intensity. He usually reserved for discussing quarterly earnings. What kind of art does the gallery focus on? He asked. Victoria's face lit up as she described the gallery's mission. She talked about supporting local artists, creating accessible art education programs, and fostering community connections through cultural events. Julian listened, stealing glances at her animated expression as they navigated through Manhattan. Traffic. You really love what you do, he observed. Absolutely, Victoria said without hesitation. Even though it pays terribly and the hours are unpredictable, I can't imagine doing anything else. Well, except maybe becoming a lawyer someday, which is a whole other story. Lawyer, Julian repeated, intrigued. Evening classes at Columbia, Victoria explained. I want to specialize in arts advocacy and nonprofit law. Help organizations like the gallery navigate legal challenges and secure better funding structures. As they approached the museum district, Julian found himself slowing down, reluctant to end this unexpectedly engaging conversation. The parting that wasn't really a parting, this is perfect, Victoria said as Julian pulled up near the museum. Thank you so much for the ride and for being incredibly gracious about my dramatic entrance into your morning. She gathered her things and opened the door, then paused. Julian, she said, I hope this doesn't sound presumptuous, but if you're ever interested in supporting local arts, the Morrison Gallery would love to have you visit. We're always looking for people who appreciate creativity and community impact. Julian reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. Actually, he said, I'd be very interested in learning more about the gallery. Perhaps you could. Tell me more about those funding challenges over coffee sometime. Victoria took the card and her eyes widened slightly as she read it. Blackstone Technologies, she murmured. You're that Julian Blackstone, guilty as charged. Julian said with a self-deprecating smile, though I promise I'm much more interesting than my Wikipedia page suggests. Victoria laughed, shaking her head in amazement. I accidentally carjacked a tech billionaire. Rebecca is never going to believe this story. Well, Julian said, you'll have to introduce me to Rebecca sometime, so I can corroborate your tale. As Victoria walked toward the museum, Julian watched her go, noting the confident set of her shoulders and the way she seemed to navigate the bustling sidewalk with purpose and grace. He sat in his car for a moment longer than necessary, already looking forward to a coffee conversation with the the most interesting person he'd met in years. Victoria, meanwhile, found herself smiling as she climbed the museum steps. Her morning had started with panic and embarrassment, but somehow ended with possibility. She tucked Julian's business card carefully into her wallet, right next to her student ID and her gallery employee badge. The presentation ahead suddenly felt less daunting. After all, if she could handle accidentally kidnapping a billionaire, she could certainly handle a room full of potential investors. As she disappeared through the museum's imposing entrance, Julian finally drove away, already planning how he might help save a struggling art gallery and see Victoria Sterling again. The morning that had started with a simple case of mistaken identity had become something neither of them had expected, and both somehow knew this was just the beginning. 3 days after her unexpected encounter with Julian Blackstone, Victoria arrived at the Morrison Gallery to find her boss, Thomas Wright, pacing behind the reception desk like a caged animal. His usually pristine appearance was disheveled, his graying hair sticking up at odd angles, and his trademark bow tie hung loosely around his neck. "Victoria, thank goodness you're here," Thomas said without preamble. "We need to talk." The gallery felt different that morning. The carefully curated artwork seemed to watch from the walls with silent judgment, and the natural light streaming through the large windows couldn't quite dispel the sense of impending doom that hung in the air like morning fog. Victoria set down her coffee and laptop bag, noting the stack of official-looking documents spread across Thomas's usually immaculate desk. Her stomach dropped as she recognized the letterhead from their landlord's legal team. "How bad is it?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Thomas handed her the top document with shaking hands. "We have 30 days to pay 3 months of back rent, plus penalties. If we can't come up with $80,000 by the end of the month, we're out." Victoria sank into the nearest chair, her mind racing through impossible calculations. The gallery barely broke even on good months, and lately those had been few and far between. The presentation at the museum had gone well, but the potential investors were still considering their options, which in her experience was polite code for probably not interested. "What about the Henderson collection sale?" she asked, grasping for any possible solution. "Fell through yesterday," Thomas replied, slumping into his own chair. "The buyer decided to invest in cryptocurrency instead. Apparently, digital assets are more fashionable than supporting living artists." Victoria stared at the eviction notice, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her job or even Thomas's livelihood. The gallery currently represented 15 emerging artists, and they had 3 community art programs running for local schools. Closing would ripple through the neighborhood in ways that went far beyond simple economics. An unexpected landlord, the gallery's bell chimed, announcing a visitor. Victoria looked up to see a woman in an elegant navy suit entering, followed by someone she'd never expected to see again. Julian Blackstone stepped through the doorway, and Victoria felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. He looked just as polished as he had in his car, but there was something different about his expression. It's more focused, more purposeful. "It's Mr. Wright," the woman said, extending her hand to Thomas. "I'm Nina Blackstone from Blackstone Properties. We spoke on the phone about the building." Victoria's mind struggled to process this information. Blackstone Properties. It's the same Blackstone as Julian. Her eyes met his across the gallery space, and she saw her own surprise reflected in his expression. "Ms. Blackstone," Thomas said, straightening his bow tie with nervous energy. "I wasn't expecting you so early. I thought this was just a routine building inspection." Nina glanced at Julian, who stepped forward with what Victoria was beginning to recognize as his characteristic calm confidence. "Actually, Mr. Wright, there's been a recent change in ownership. My company acquired this building last week as part of a larger portfolio purchase. I wanted to meet with all the tenants personally to discuss the transition." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. Julian owned their building. The man she'd accidentally carjacked was now, technically, their landlord. The universe apparently had a twisted sense of humor. "I see," Thomas said carefully. "And what does this mean for our lease agreement?" Julian's eyes found Victoria's again, and she saw something she couldn't quite interpret in his gaze. "It means we need to have a conversation about the future of this space." The proposition Nina excused herself to examine the building's electrical systems, leaving Julian alone with Victoria and Thomas. The gallery suddenly felt much smaller with his presence filling it. "Victoria," Julian said, his voice carrying a note of genuine surprise, "I didn't realize you worked here when I acquired the building." "You bought our building?" Victoria said, standing up from her chair with more force than necessary. "Bought our building and didn't think to mention it when we met. The acquisition was finalized yesterday," Julian explained. "I had no idea about the connection until my property manager briefed me on the tenants this morning." Thomas looked between them with growing confusion. "You to know each other?" "We met earlier this week," Victoria said tersely, "under rather unusual circumstances." Julian had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Victoria accidentally got into my car, thinking it was her rideshare." "She what?" Thomas blinked rapidly. As if this information was too strange to process alongside everything else happening, Victoria felt heat rising in her cheeks. "It was a misunderstanding that's completely irrelevant to our current situation." Julian stepped closer to the eviction notice still spread across Thomas's desk. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the documents. Thomas nodded mutely, still processing the revelation about his employee's adventure and accidental carjacking. Julian read through the papers quickly, its expression growing more serious with each page. 80,000 in back rent and penalties. That's substantial for a space this size. The previous landlord raised our rent twice in 18 months, Victoria said defensively. We've been struggling to keep up while maintaining our programming and supporting our artists. Of programming? Julian asked, looking around the gallery with new interest. Thomas seemed to shake off his confusion and stepped into familiar territory. We run art education programs for 3 local schools, provide studio space for emerging artists at below-market rates, and host community events that bring cultural programming to this neighborhood. Julian walked slowly through the gallery, examining the artwork with careful attention. Victoria found herself watching him, trying to read his expression as he stopped in front of a vibrant mural created by students from the local high school. "This is impressive work," he said, pausing at a sculpture made from recycled materials. "Who's the artist?" "Maria Santos," Victoria said, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "She's 22, works 2 jobs to support her family, and creates these pieces in her spare time. The gallery is the only place that's ever displayed her work professionally." Julian continued his circuit of the space, asking thoughtful questions about the artists and their backgrounds. Victoria found herself relaxing slightly as she talked. About the gallery's mission and the impact they'd had on the community. "You know," Julian said finally, "I've been looking for ways to support arts education in the city." Victoria's pulse quickened. "What kind of support?" "It's a kind that might solve your immediate financial problems and ensure the long-term sustainability of this program." The catch Thomas practically vibrated with excitement. "Mr. Blackstone, if you're serious about supporting the gallery, we would be eternally grateful." Julian held up a hand. "I am serious, but I want to be completely transparent about what I'm proposing." Victoria felt her stomach tighten. In her experience, when wealthy people talked about transparency, it usually meant the terms were about to get complicated. "I'd like to restructure your lease agreement," Julian continued. "Reduced rent in exchange for expanded programming and community outreach. I want to turn this into a flagship cultural center for the neighborhood." "That sounds wonderful," Thomas said immediately. "There's more," Julian said, his eyes finding Victoria's. "I'd also like to fund a position for a full-time arts education coordinator, someone who could develop curriculum, manage community partnerships, and help secure additional grants and funding." Victoria's heart began to race. "You're talking about creating a new job?" "I'm talking about creating your job," Julian said simply. "If you're interested." The gallery fell silent except for the distant sound of Nina's heels clicking on the hardwood floors upstairs. Victoria stared at Julian, trying to process what he was offering. "You want to hire me?" she said slowly. "I want to invest in what you're already doing," Julian corrected. "You clearly have the passion and vision for this work. The position would come with a substantial salary increase and full benefits, plus funding for you to complete your law degree." Victoria felt Thomas's excited gaze boring into her, but she couldn't look away from Julian's steady blue eyes. "And what would you get out of this arrangement?" Julian's expression became more serious. a successful community arts program that serves as a model for other neighborhoods, tax benefits from supporting a nonprofit initiative, and the satisfaction of knowing I helped preserve something valuable. It? Victoria asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. That's it, Julian confirmed. But Victoria had spent enough time around wealthy donors to recognize the unspoken expectations that often came with generous offers. Julian, I need to ask you something directly. Of course. Is this offer related? To our personal interaction the other day, Julian was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria appreciated that he seemed to be considering his answer carefully rather than responding with automatic denial. Your passion for this work impressed me, he said finally. But I would never use my position as your landlord to pressure you into any kind of personal relationship. This offer is professional, and it remains on the table regardless of whether you ever speak to me socially again. The decision Thomas looked like he might faint from excitement. Victoria, this is incredible. This could solve all our problems. Victoria nodded slowly, but her mind was spinning with complications Thomas couldn't see. Accepting Julian's offer would solve their immediate crisis, but it would also create a permanent connection between her and a man she was already finding disturbingly attractive. I need time to think about it, she said. Julian nodded. Of course, take all the time you need. How much time do we have? Thomas asked, practical concerns overriding everything else. The eviction notice gives you 30 days, Julian said. But I can halt that process immediately and extend your current lease terms while you consider the proposal. Victoria felt a wave of relief followed immediately by a new wave of anxiety. Julian was essentially offering to save the gallery with no strings attached, giving her time to decide about the job offer. It was generous to the point of being almost suspicious. Why? She asked. Why would you help us even if I don't take the position? Julian glanced around the gallery again, his gaze lingering on the student artwork. Because what you're doing here matters. This neighborhood needs cultural spaces, and these artists need support. It's not complicated. Nina's footsteps on the stairs announced her return. The building is in excellent condition, she reported. A few minor electrical updates needed, but nothing significant. Good, Julian said. Nina, please prepare a lease. Extension for Mr. Wright, and halt any eviction proceedings. Certainly, Nina replied, making notes on her tablet. Julian turned back to Victoria and Thomas. I'll have my team put together a formal proposal for the expanded programming and funding. We should have everything by tomorrow afternoon. Yes. The Blackstone siblings prepared to leave? Julian paused near the door. Victoria, would you walk with me for a moment? Thomas practically pushed her toward the door. Victoria found herself on the sidewalk outside the gallery, suddenly alone with Julian again. I meant what I said in there, Julian said quietly. Yes. Offer isn't contingent on anything personal between us. I believe you, Victoria said, and realized she actually did. But I also meant what I said about getting coffee, Julian continued with a slight smile. That invitation stands entirely separate from any business arrangement. Victoria looked back at the gallery, where Thomas was probably already planning how to spend money they didn't have yet. Then she looked at Julian, who was offering solutions to problems she'd been losing sleep over for months. Julian, she said carefully, if I take this job, if I accept your help with the gallery, things could get complicated. They could, Julian agreed. But some things are worth a little complication. As he walked away, Victoria remained on the sidewalk, watching his figure disappear around the corner. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca asking about her day. Victoria stared at the message, trying to figure out how to explain that her morning had just gotten turned completely upside down again. Inside the gallery, Thomas was practically dancing between the easels, already making plans for their suddenly bright future. Victoria joined him, but her mind remained fixed on Julian's parting words. Some things are worth a little complication. She was beginning to suspect he might be right. 2 weeks after Julian's proposal, Victoria's carefully balanced world collapsed in the span of a single phone call. She was reviewing grant applications in her temporary office at the gallery when her phone rang, displaying her mother's number at an hour when she should have been at work. Mom, Victoria answered, immediately sensing something was wrong from the unusual timing. Victoria, honey, her mother's voice was strained, fighting back tears. There's been an accident. The grant application slipped from Victoria's fingers as her mother explained how her father, Robert Sterling, had fallen from scaffolding at his construction site. 3 broken ribs, a fractured hip, and potential spinal damage that wouldn't be clear until the swelling went down. He was stable but would need surgery and months of rehabilitation. The insurance will cover some of it, her mother continued, but the deductibles and the time off work. Victoria, I don't know how we're going to manage. Victoria's mind immediately began calculating numbers she knew wouldn't add up. Her parents had always lived paycheck to paycheck, and her father's construction job provided their only steady income. Her mother worked part-time at a local diner, but those wages wouldn't cover their mortgage, let alone medical bills that could easily reach 6 figures. I'll figure something out, Victoria promised, though she had no idea how. Don't worry about the money right now. Just focus on Dad. After hanging up, Victoria sat in her borrowed office space, staring at Julian's formal proposal document that had arrived that morning. The position he was offering came with a salary that would allow her to help her parents significantly, but accepting felt different now, tinged with desperation rather than opportunity. The visit that changed everything. Victoria took the train to Queens that evening, making her way to the hospital where her father lay connected to various monitors and tubes. Robert Sterling had always been a large, robust man who solved problems with his hands and his unwavering work ethic. Seeing him diminished and vulnerable in the sterile hospital bed broke something inside her chest. "Hey, Dad," she said softly, taking his hand. Robert's eyes opened, focusing on her with effort. "Victoria, sweetheart, you didn't need to come all this way." "Of course I did," she said, fighting back tears. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck." Robert attempted a weak smile. "But the doctors say I'll be okay eventually. Might take a while to get back to work, though." Victoria's mother, Patricia, looked exhausted as she updated Victoria on the medical situation. The surgery would cost $40,000 even after insurance, and Robert would be unable to work for at least 4 months, possibly longer, depending on his recovery. "We'll manage somehow," Patricia said with false brightness. "We always do." But Victoria could see the fear in her mother's eyes, and the way her father's jaw tightened when he thought no one was looking. They were proud people who had worked hard their entire lives, and this crisis threatened to destroy everything they had built. That night, Victoria lay awake in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by faded posters and participation trophies, trying to figure out how to help her family without compromising her own principles. She had been so careful to build her independence, to prove she could succeed on her own merit. But independence felt like a luxury when her father needed surgery they couldn't afford. The unexpected discovery the next morning. Victoria returned to the gallery to find Thomas in an unusually good mood, practically bouncing as he organized the newest exhibition. "Victoria, you'll never believe what happened," he said, waving an envelope in the air. "We received an anonymous donation. It's $25,000, just like that." Victoria's stomach dropped. Anonymous from whom? That's just it, completely. Anonymous. The check came through a legal firm with instructions that it was for gallery operations and artist support. No strings attached, no recognition required. Victoria examined the check, noting the law firm's prestigious Manhattan address. Her suspicions crystallized when she noticed the firm's name appeared on several of the documents Julian had provided with his proposal. "Thomas, I need to make a phone call," she said, already pulling out her phone. Julian answered on the second. "Ring, Victoria, how are you?" "Did you send the gallery an anonymous donation?" she asked without preamble. A pause. "Do you ask?" "Because we received $25,000 from a law firm that I suspect you use, and the timing is rather convenient." "Victoria, Julian, please just answer the question honestly." Another pause, longer this time. "Yes, I sent the donation." Victoria closed her eyes, feeling a mixture of gratitude and frustration. "Because the gallery needs support, regardless of whether you accept my job offer. And because anonymous donations allow you to maintain your independence while still getting help. Except it's not really anonymous if I know it came from you. Would you prefer I hadn't helped?" Victoria found herself without a clear answer. The donation would allow the gallery to operate comfortably for months. taking pressure off everyone while they implemented Julian's larger proposal, but it also meant she was already indebted to him in ways that complicated everything. "I need to see you," she said finally. "We need to talk in person, of course." "When and where?" "Tonight. At 7 o'clock. There's a coffee shop called Brew on 84th Street. Do you know it?" "I'll find it," Julian said. "Victoria, is everything all right? You sound stressed." Victoria almost laughed at the understatement. "Everything is complicated right now. I'll explain tonight." The Confession Brew was exactly the kind of place Victoria had chosen intentionally. Small, unpretentious, filled with students and local residents rather than the business crowd Julian usually moved among. She arrived first, claiming a corner table where they could talk privately, and ordered coffee she was too nervous to drink. Julian appeared precisely at 7, looking somehow different in dark jeans and a simple sweater. Instead of his usual business attire, he spotted her immediately and made his way over, carrying himself with the same confident grace, but seeming more approachable. "Thank you for meeting me," Victoria said as he sat down. "Of course, can I get you another coffee?" Victoria shook her head, then changed her mind. "Actually, yes, something with caffeine. It's been a long day." Julian returned with 2 coffees and a concerned expression. "What's going on, Victoria? You seem upset?" Victoria had rehearsed this conversation during the train ride back to Manhattan. But sitting across from Julian, she found herself struggling to begin. "My father was injured at work yesterday," she said finally. "He needs surgery that my family can't afford." Julian's expression immediately shifted to genuine concern. "So sorry, how serious is it?" Victoria explained the situation, watching Julian's face as she described her family's financial crisis. She saw no calculation in his expression, no sense that he was viewing this as an opportunity, just honest sympathy and what looked like a desire to help. "The salary you offered would allow me to help them," Victoria continued. "But accepting your job offer now feels like I'm taking advantage of your generosity because I'm desperate." "Victoria," Julian said gently, "people accept jobs for financial reasons all the time. That doesn't diminish your qualifications or make the offer less legitimate." "But it changes my motivations," Victoria insisted. "I want to take the position because it's right for my career and the gallery's mission, not because I need the money to help my family." Julian was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. If your father wasn't injured, if your family was financially secure, would you want the job?" Victoria considered the question seriously. "Yes," she admitted. "I think I would." "Then your current circumstances don't invalidate that desire. Just make the decision more urgent." Victoria looked at him across the small table, noting how the coffee shop's warm lighting softened his usually sharp features. "Julian, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Always. Are you interested in me romantically?" Julian's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips, set it down carefully, and met her gaze directly. "Yes," he said simply. Victoria felt her heart do something complicated in response to his honesty. "And is that influencing your professional offers?" "Oh," Julian said without hesitation. "I was attracted to you from the moment you panicked in my car, but I would never use business arrangements to pursue a personal relationship. The gallery needed help before I met you, and you're qualified for the position regardless of my feelings." Victoria studied his expression, looking for any sign of deception. She found none. "I'm attracted to you too," she said quietly, surprising herself with her own honesty. Julian's eyes widened slightly. "Oh." "Which is exactly why this situation is so complicated," Victoria continued. "If I accept your help, your job offer, how do we separate the professional from the personal? How do I know I'm making good decisions instead of just responding to feelings I shouldn't be having about my potential boss?" The solution. Julian leaned back in his chair, processing her words carefully. "What if we removed me from the equation?" "What do you mean?" "What if I structured the funding and job offer through a foundation? With an independent board making decisions about your employment, I would provide the financial backing, but you would report to someone else entirely." Victoria blinked. "You would do that? If it meant you could accept help without feeling compromised?" "Yes, but then you wouldn't have any control over the program you're funding." Julian smiled slightly. Victoria, I'm not funding this program because I want control. I'm funding it because I believe in what you're doing. Whether I have oversight or not doesn't change the value of the work. Victoria felt something shift inside her chest. Julian was offering to remove himself from power over her professional life, effectively eliminating any possibility that she might feel pressured into a personal relationship. There's something else, Julian said, his voice becoming more serious. About your father's medical bills? Victoria tensed. Julian, no, I can't accept personal financial help from you. I'm not offering personal help, Julian said quickly. I'm offering to connect your father with a doctor I know who specializes in construction injuries. Dr. Margaret Chen at Mount Sinai. She's developed some innovative treatment approaches that could potentially reduce both the recovery time and the cost. Victoria stared at him. You want to help my father get better medical care? I want to help your father get the best possible outcome from his injury. Dr. Chen has connections with social workers who specialize in helping families navigate insurance and payment options. It's not charity, it's just better resources. Would you do that? Julian's expression became very serious, because your father raised someone extraordinary. And because no one should have to choose between medical care and financial security? Victoria felt tears threatening for the first time since her mother's phone call. Julian wasn't trying to solve her problems with money. He was trying to connect her family with better options, resources they might not have known existed. The leap of faith if I accept your foundation proposal, Victoria said slowly. And if I take Dr. Chen's information for my father, what happens between us personally? Julian's smile was soft and genuine. Whatever we want to happen, completely separate from any professional arrangement. Victoria looked around the coffee shop, noting the other conversations happening at nearby tables. Students discussing assignments, friends catching up, couples on dates. Normal people living normal lives, making decisions based on feelings and circumstances and hope. I have a condition, she said finally. Name it. I want to contribute something to this foundation you're creating. Not money, I don't have any. But I want to help structure it, help decide how it operates and what other programs it supports. I don't want to just be a recipient of your generosity. Julian's expression lit up with something that looked like admiration. I think that's a brilliant idea. I want Dr. Chen's information for my father. I'll send it to you tonight. And Julian, yes. Victoria took a deep breath, feeling like she was about to jump off a cliff into completely unknown territory. I would like to have dinner with you sometime, somewhere nicer than this coffee shop, completely separate from any business arrangement. Julian's smile was radiant. I would like that very much. As they left the coffee shop together, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope, not just for her father's recovery or the gallery's future, but for the possibility that sometimes taking a leap of faith led to something beautiful rather than something broken. Julian walked her to the subway station, and as she descended the steps, Victoria looked back to see him watching her go with an expression that made her heart race with anticipation rather than anxiety. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca asking about her mysterious evening plans. Victoria smiled as she typed back, I think I just figured out how to save everything that matters to me. The train carried her back to Queens, where her father was healing, and her future was suddenly full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Sometimes, Victoria reflected, the best decisions were the ones that required the most courage, and sometimes the most complicated situations led to the most beautiful solutions. 3 months later, Robert Sterling would walk Victoria down the aisle at her wedding to Julian Blackstone, fully recovered thanks to Dr. Chen's innovative treatment. The Morrison Gallery would become the flagship location for the Sterling Blackstone Arts Foundation, supporting emerging artists in 12 cities. But that evening, riding the subway home with Julian's business card in her pocket and hope in her heart, Victoria simply smiled and believed that everything was about to change for the better.